Let's continue talking about Annie Duke's book, Living, uh, Thinking in Bets. She's talking about the problems with how we make decisions, and we started with her first concept, which is this idea of resulting. And so, resulting is the concept that decision quality is gauged entirely on outcomes. And she's saying that's a mistake because there's so much randomness um, and just pure luck in our decisions. We tend to say, hey, it turned out well, so it must have been a good decision. The decision quality must be high because the outcome was good. And she said, if you do that, you're going to make many mistakes. The second issue she raises is hindsight bias, which is closely related to resulting, but we see an outcome as inevitable as a result of our decision rather than a probabilistic one. We think the world's more orderly, more predictable than it really is, and so we ignore false positives, a good result after a bad decision, and we ignore false negatives, a bad result after a good decision. Very similar to resulting. We tend to jump to the assumption of causation when there's really only a random correlation. We like to cherry pick data to confirm our biases. Again, remember earlier we talked our biggest motivation is our egos and supporting our egos. um, Being aware of this bias is not sufficient because we do so much system one thinking. We make so many decisions quickly without much really deep thought, and so because of that, even though we're aware of this bias, we'll still make terrible mistakes, mainly because just we're moving so fast. And sample sizes can be really small, but we need to move fast, and so we make assumptions that make the next decision easier. It's just when to spend so much time on it. So she's saying we need to be more deliberate after the fact and assessing the outcomes and thinking that there's other things going on here other than just our decision quality. And how do you do that? Well, she's saying one of the mistakes we make is we don't look at the world probabilistically. So we need to stop looking at the world as if it's a series of objective black and white events, and we need to focus more on the process, not on the outcome. And we should shift, and she'll talk about this later when she talks about solutions. And I strongly encourage you change the way you speak. I've been trying this as much as I can to start talking probabilistically, using probabilistic language, and we'll see what that means later when she gives some examples. When we see a low probability event and it happens, we say, wow, I was right. Or we knew we're not wrong. And you'll hear people say this, something that has a small probability happening, maybe a 20% chance of happening. and then it happens, and someone says, yeah, I think that'll happen. I think there's a chance that'll happen. And then it happens, and then after the fact they say, yeah, I knew that was going to happen. I even said it was going to happen. And it's not true, but we actually remember it that way because, it supports our ego. So thinking in probabilities, actually, she says, will protect your egos, moving from you were right to you were wrong language. So like in the 2016, you had Brexit and U.S. presidential election, and a lot of people were saying, wow, the pollsters were wrong. But the pollsters didn't say Trump was going to lose. The pollsters said there's only a 40% chance, there was a little over a 40% chance that Brexit would happen and that Trump would win. Well, 40% is a really high probability. So if someone says there's over a 40% chance that something's going to happen and then it happens, we shouldn't say they were wrong. We should simply say, yeah, it had a good probability of happening and it happened, and we shouldn't beat them up about that. You shouldn't beat yourself up about it. However, you've got to start speaking in probabilistic terms. This is very, very important with your boss, especially in investment jobs. Your boss wants you to give definitive answers, and you shouldn't do it. You should not cave in on that. Your boss says, what's the Fed going to do next week? You should say, hey, I think there's more than 50% chance that they're going to raise rates, but I still think there's a good 40% chance that they don't. I think, and this is why I think this. Give yourself an out so that your ego has an out, and also that you don't, if you're right, you don't give yourself too much credit, and if you're wrong, you don't start blaming some outside forces. Skewing is extremely important. We talked some about skewing when I talked about options. If you're going to bet on skewing, bet on positive skews and not on negative skews. That's a very big part of what Taleb was talking about. So understanding the distribution and understanding if it is skewed. So it might be smart to go for the long shot. Something has a less than a 50% chance of happening if the payout is extremely huge. You might think that only has a 20% chance of happening, but if that 20% is going to make you 4,000%, where you're 80%, you only make 4%. Yeah, so maybe you could make 6%, but instead you go for the 4% because the 4% return has a 20% chance of a 4,000% return. Then going for the long shot makes sense, even if its expected return is lower. So playing the highest probability is not always the right answer because of skewing. And then get back to this, protecting our egos. It's difficult to look at a decision for errors when you have a good outcome, but you should do it. You should make that a habit. Soros is a famous investor who kept a diary, and in his diary, he wrote every decision he made and why. And then when the outcome came, he would assess the outcome in terms of whether he was right or he was lucky. So if he says, I think A is going to happen because of Z, and then A happens, but not because of Z, but because of X, he would actually say, I was wrong. What I thought was going to happen happened, but it didn't happen for the reason I thought it would. So I was lucky, I wasn't right. So back to what I said earlier in her book, we assume skill when we have good outcomes, and we assume bad luck when we have bad outcomes, because that's what protects our egos. And why is that? It gets back to what Kahneman said. Being wrong hurts twice as much as being right. That's part of that theory he had of, we're risk averse in the gain side, and we're actually risk seeking in the downside. We'll do whatever it takes to protect our egos. So her recommendation is, if you reduce the positive vibes that comes when the outcome is good, in order to reduce the hurt ego when things are bad, you actually can be happier in life. So rather than jumping to the conclusion, wow, it came out just like I thought it was, rather than come out and boost your ego on that, pull back on that and say, hey, I might have been right or I might have been lucky. To give yourself a chance on the times where the outcome is bad, but it might have been just bad luck. So give up some of the praise on good outcomes in order to reduce some of the anguish on bad outcomes. Another big thing she talks about is opportunity costs. And opportunity costs is what we lose for not doing B because we instead do A. So I like this phrase. She says, opportunity costs create bets against our future selves. All decisions create risk, even those with good outcomes, because something else might have been better. So we say, hey, I bought Apple stock and it's up 10%, so I made the right decision. Well, you could have bought Alphabet and it's up 20%. Maybe all tech stocks are up 10, 15%. So think about the opportunity costs. That's what you talked somewhat when we were talking about the pension crisis and looking at the opportunity costs and creating benchmarks. One thing we do for benchmarks is it says, that's what the opportunity cost is. But often we pick benchmarks not based on the opportunity cost, but based on what everybody else is doing. So I think the whole of investing, the whole of finance often misses great opportunities and ignores opportunity costs that we could have had because we set our benchmarks based on convention, not based on a full analysis of what's out there. And then we have motivated reasoning. The quality of our decisions depends on the quality of our beliefs and knowledge. So we need to get better information, improve accuracy. That should be our number one goal in decision making, is get better information. Unfortunately, we believe way too much without any basis in fact. Often the first time we hear something, we believe it because it supports something we already have a bias to believe. We're far less open-minded than we think. Boy, when I was discussing this book once, I wanted to bring up some of the fake news you see on Facebook. I have several friends on Facebook who are absolutely convinced of their omnipotence, that they know everything absolutely with certainty, and they'll post things. I remember once it was a T-shirt that Whoopi Goldberg supposedly was wearing. It was a really offensive T-shirt. There's a picture of her. I looked at it, and my first thought was, Whoopi Goldberg's a pretty smart lady. She's managed her career fairly well. You could strongly disagree with everything she believes, but she's not a stupid person, and wearing that shirt would have been really stupid. So my first thought is, that's got to be Photoshopped. And so I researched it some, and sure enough, it was Photoshopped. Whoopi Goldberg had actually put an entire internet page up to prove that that was not the shirt she was wearing, and she showed the actual picture of the shirt she was actually wearing. And so it was, to me it seemed obvious, and yet this person put that picture out there to show, hey, look what a horrible person Whoopi Goldberg is. Well, a friend of mine from high school pointed out to this person that that was Photoshopped, and her answer was, that may be a Photoshop picture, but that's the type of thing Whoopi Goldberg would have done. And I was just like, how ridiculous can you be? And preparing for this presentation, though, I started writing down all of those fake news things I saw on Facebook, and I came up with over 20 of them in just a few days. Things that I saw on Facebook that I knew could not possibly be true. They just seemed so ridiculous. So I did some research, went out and looked, and found what I think is evidence. Obviously, I didn't prove that it was fake, but I found evidence that seemed to me overwhelming that it was fake. I remember one. It was a lady who was saying boycott Pepsi because they took "Under God" out of the Pledge of Allegiance. And I thought about that. To me, the logic is, does it make sense for the CEO and CFO of Pepsi to sit around and say, hey, let's put the Pledge of Allegiance on our cans, but let's leave "Under God" off of it. That won't cause any problems. Everybody will love that. Obviously, that would be a really ridiculously stupid decision to make. So I researched it, and actually it wasn't Pepsi at all. It was Dr. Pepper. It was after 9/11, and Dr. Pepper didn't put the Pledge of Allegiance on their can. They just put the words, "One Nation Indivisible," and those were the words from the Pledge of Allegiance that they wanted to put after 9/11. And some people got offended that they left out "Under God" in between, and so they took those cans out and stopped using them. It went away really quickly. But here's a person on Facebook telling her friends you should boycott Pepsi when Pepsi didn't even have anything to do with it, and it wasn't it. The whole thing was a complete fake story. But they were 100% convinced when they put that on Facebook that they were right, that that was a true story. They did no research on it at all. We believe stuff with so little evidence. I'm sure I'm guilty of that just as much as they are. I just notice it more with others than myself, just because, again, we have these biases. So we're inclined to type 1 errors versus type 2 errors. Type 1 error is you believe the line is in the grass when there's not a line in the grass. A type 2 error is you believe there's a line is not in the grass when it is. Well, it's better to make a type 1 error than a type 2 error. A type 1 error, you're cautious when you don't need to be. Type 2 is when you're not cautious when you should be. We seek out evidence confirming our beliefs. Confirmation bias is a huge issue in finance. And and that's why I say your ego is so important. Once you invest your ego, anytime you see an article that confirms what you just predicted, boy, you will quickly grab onto that. You won't challenge anything that confirms what you believe, and you'll immediately discredit information that contradicts your belief. I think you should do the exact opposite. When you have a strong belief, I think you should actually go out and seek writers, speakers, podcasts that are on the exact opposite of what you believe. Actually seek out to have your mind changed versus seeking to have it confirmed. And it's painful. You just told your boss, wow, the Fed's going to raise rates next week. And then you see this article from Goldman Sachs that says, we don't think the Fed's going to raise next week. The natural tendency is to say, oh, credits, Goldman Sachs, they don't know what they're talking about. They didn't get the last ones. We just throw them out. We see another article that says the Fed is going to raise rates from Morgan Stanley. We say, oh, Morgan Stanley, man, they're good guys. They know what they're talking about. We do that so naturally. I'd encourage you to intentionally do the exact opposite. So the goal of fake news is not to change minds, but to rather solidify what people already believe. Disinformation is even more powerful when some of the information is confirmed. So if you want to try to fool people, write something on Facebook but make some of the information in there clearly true and just have a little bit of it false. I've seen that a lot in discussions about Medicare and Social Security and political things. The Affordable Care Act, I've saw so much fake information on the Affordable Care Act. I actually pointed it out to some people on Facebook, and one of the guys said is that hyperbole was okay to emphasize a point, and so he used the word hyperbole. As long as you say hyperbole, then lying is okay. But the things they were saying about the Affordable Care Act were nowhere in the Affordable Care Act. So my point is, if you don't like the Affordable Care Act, at least debate it with the facts of what's actually in the law. So, but some of what their complaints were actually true, but a lot of what they're saying was not in the law at all. So it gave it the sense of being believable because some of the things everybody said, oh yeah, that's true, so everything else must be true. It's really hard to admit we're wrong on something we're committed to for years. So we fight anything that contradicts that belief. And smart people actually have more problems with this than not as smart people, even experts. This is interesting research, but they did some research on a non-controversial issue like skin creams and on a controversial issue like gun control. And people who are more knowledgeable of skin creams did really well on the quiz, but people who are more knowledgeable on gun control actually did worse on the controversial issue. So the more they knew about the issue, the worse they were, the more controversial it was, the more ego they had invested, the more their intelligence actually harmed them in the questioning. I'm not saying that the question was like, are you pro-gun control or pro or con gun control? They were actually asking factual questions about certain events, and people were answering them with great confidence, whether or not it supported their beliefs or contradicted their beliefs on gun control, not based on the actual facts and the statistics that were provided. So we're wired to protect our beliefs, and intelligence and awareness of those biases don't rescue us. All right, so what we'll do in the next one, I think is the exciting part of this, is how can we get better at this? And so she has some specific strategies. Some of them I actually have used, and I'll give you some of the cases I've used them. Won't to bet, I haven't had the guts to try that yet, but I've been tempted to on Facebook especially, but I'll talk about that one. Signing probabilities up front, that's that probabilistic thinking, and using the language of probabilities, using the language of uncertainty. Build sample sizes with your own experiences, and not only your experiences, but your other people's experiences. Look for improvement after outcomes, especially good outcomes. Create a decision pod. I did that at UTSA. I think it's quite powerful. And then my favorite one of all, which I use all the time, I use this one constantly, is I think it is so powerful, and that's her concept of time travel. So next session, we'll get into these solutions, and I'm hoping you'll find some of these that you'll use. I think finance is one of the areas where this is more powerful than it is in others. All right, so we'll stop there.